Enforced equality of outcome at Canadian universities takes another bold step forward as the federal government rolls out Dimensions, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Canada, a pilot program designed to bolster commitment to social justice within academia. I'm your host, B.A. Jarvis, and you're watching The Golden Door. All right, we're back with another story centered around diversity and inclusion and equity ideology, commonly referred to as DIE ideology on the right and any other version of the acronym on the left. This is a story that wasn't heavily reported within the Canadian media, so we're going to go straight to an American source for this one. As reported by PJ Media, Canadian government imposes social justice on all universities. The Liberal Government of Canada has formulated a new program which all universities are expected to commit. It is called Dimensions, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. A charter for Dimensions has been distributed to all university presidents who are urged to sign, endorsing the program for their universities. Minister for Science and Sport Christy Duncan launched this program using, quote, independent funding councils, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, the National Science and Engineering Council, and the Social Science and Humanities Research Council as the conduit for Dimensions grants. It is not the first time that Minister Duncan has opposed equity, diversity, and inclusion conditions for grants. In 2017, new diversity criteria were enunciated for the Canadian Research Chair grants. So I wasn't aware of these research funding changes before I made this video, but I'll link the corresponding announcements in the description below. However, I do want to highlight a couple of paragraphs from each of the corresponding press releases. So this is the first announcement from the federal government dated November 2017 that highlights the Canadian Research Chairs program changes that will lead to greater diversity. And I just wanted to highlight this one section here. In addition to these changes, universities have been given a deadline of this December to submit equity, diversity, and inclusion action plans that will map out how they will meet diversity and equity targets. Universities that do not meet these targets will be at risk of having their new CRCP funding withdrawn. Also, in case you're wondering, yes, they do have mapped out diversity targets for women, Indigenous people, and visible minorities. And targets, I mean quotas. Here's an example of one of the targets for visible minorities. And yes, they have every Canadian institution listed here, as well as numbers of targets, equity targets for all of their research chairs. Another announcement from the federal government, dated September 10th, 2018, deals specifically with women in the research grant positions. So, a couple of quotes I wanted to highlight from Minister Christy Duncan as well as Ted Hewitt, the president of the Shirk Society. First from Christy Duncan, when our labs and classrooms reflect the Canada we see today, all Canadians benefit. I am immensely proud of this historic achievement and commend our institutions for their hard work. This is a big step forward for Canada in attracting diverse talent, including more women and other underrepresented groups. We must keep this momentum going. And second, our overarching goal is to achieve excellence by ensuring the establishment of a research community that truly reflects Canadians and our changing society. The Canada Research Chairs program is one of the most prestigious research funding programs in this country, and it's great to see that we are getting results and achieving a nomination and merit-based adjudication processes that strongly promotes diversity, equity, diversity, and inclusion. The quick fact here is that the Government of Canada is also achieving equity, diversity, and inclusion in other tri-agency areas, including Canada 150 Research Chairs program, where women account for 60% of all chairholders. So just a couple of points here. Women are obviously not an underrepresented group if they hold 60% of all chairholders in the Canada 150 Research Grant program, and I understand they're only at 44% of the other research chairs, but nevertheless, they account for the vast majority of university staff and students at this point. Second thing I want to point out is you cannot have a merit-based adjudication process that strongly promotes equity, diversity, and inclusion, because merit-based implies that you're not going to be looking at people's immutable characteristics. Also, quickly, just to give you a sense of the scope of the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Action Plan, here is a copy of it from the Canadian government website again, and it's multi-point, let's say, and many things ongoing, and I can only imagine that it's going to be added to going forward. And if you thought that looked comprehensive, you should check out the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, a best practices guide for recruiting, hiring, and retention. And just to give you a sense of how seriously they're taking this initiative, it is an insanely long and detailed document as well, and I will link that in the description as well. So the amount of literature that the Canadian government has produced on the enforced equality of outcome at Canadian universities within the last 2 years alone is pretty staggering. But anyway, let's go back to the PJ Media article. What is equity, diversity, and inclusion in aid of? According to the Charter of the Dimensions program, the objective is to foster increased research excellence, innovation, and creativity within the post-secondary sector across all disciplines. Who could object to increased research excellence, innovation, and creativity, which is the conventional and legitimate objective of research administrators? What is new here is the means by which these results would be allegedly brought about through increased equity, diversity, and inclusion. According to the Charter, the post-secondary research community has the greatest potential to thrive when members experience equitable, inclusive, and unbiased systems and practices. The NSERC press release announced that the Dimensions program claims that the evidence clearly shows that increased equity, diversity, and inclusion in research environments enhances excellence, innovation, and creativity. In fact, no such evidence is adduced or cited, and readers should be skeptical of unsubstantiated claims. Without evidence, what would be prudent is to assume that the reasserted relationship is fabricated and imaginary, probably. What does equity, diversity, and inclusion mean in practice? It means that certain categories of people must be favored in academic competitions, while unfavored categories of people must be excluded. The favored must be put up for grants, or else the grants will not be forthcoming. Conversely, unfavored categories of people must be excluded from the competition, or else the grants would not be forthcoming. So the author of the article, Philip Carl Salzman, asks, I assume on behalf of his potentially naive audience, how these categories of favorables versus unfavorables are decided. And of course, anybody who's been following my videos knows exactly how it breaks down. If you are a straight white man, you are not covered under the protections of this charter, and everybody else is. So moving on. The theory of systemic barriers, much loved by sociologists, attributes the different distributions of categories of people in society to prejudice and discrimination on the basis of race, gender, and ethnicity. A, quote, social justice, equitable, diverse, and inclusive distribution would be for each gender, race, and ethnic group to be represented in every department, faculty, and university, and every list of competition winners and every new hire according to the exact percentage of the general population. And I want to just note here that if they are a little bit higher than their exact percentage of the general population at the expense of the straight white male category, all the better. The new criterion, representation according to its exact percentage in the general population, has been institutionalized without any consent of the general population, without any legislation, without any vote. It is an extreme version of equality, an equality of results, the concept of equality that is favored by radical socialists and communists, and which was imposed in failed societies such as USSR and Mao's China. Equality of results is far from a liberal idea of the equality of opportunity, in which the occupational, monetary, and academic achievements and results vary according to the motivation, preferences, abilities, and commitments of individuals. The theory of systemic barriers assumes that there is no material difference among people in regard to motivation, preferences, abilities, and commitments, and that all difference in statistical representation are the result of prejudice and discrimination. This is clearly false. One kind of evidence is the impressive statistical overrepresentation in prestigious fields by members of unpopular minorities, such as African Americans in professional sports, East Asians and Jews in academia and other professions, which clearly was not the result of prejudice and discrimination against white people, people of European descent, and Christians. Another kind of evidence is the poor school performance of some minorities, at least in part due to cultural inclinations and social pathologies of crime and single-parent families. A third kind of evidence is the differential preferences of members of different categories. Despite a full court press on the part of universities and professional organizations to recruit females to science and engineering, they remain heavily underrepresented in spite of discrimination in favor of females and against males. Where females are free to choose, they choose social sciences, social work, law, or medicine, or anything but natural science and engineering. This is true not only in North America, but in feminist countries of Sweden and Norway, where fewer females choose science and engineering than anywhere else in the world. A fourth kind of evidence is the poor results in the decades of so-called affirmative action, discrimination in favor of underrepresented minorities. Not surprisingly, individuals from underrepresented minorities recruited with weak academic records, given special funding, and provided with segregated identity housing do poorly at universities. Thus, there are many factors that influence underrepresentation of certain categories of individuals that are not systemic barriers involving prejudice and discrimination. Furthermore, if females are subject to systemic barriers, explicit and unconscious bias, and inequities, as the Charter claims, how can we explain that, according to StatsCan, women continue to outnumber men in most fields of study, making up 56.2% of students, dominating in education, health, and related fields? Is it that females are discriminated against in funding? To take one example, females account for 60% of the awardees of the Canada 150 research chairs, as I mentioned earlier. How can we explain why 56.2% of female enrollment and 60% of female chairholders are not sufficient equity, diversity, and inclusion, requiring, according to the Dimensions program, even more places and benefits to females? So I just want to mention a couple things here. First, the article does link a lot of research. So again, there's a lot of links in the article that are actually obscured by the highlighting. So I just want to point that out, and I will link this article in the description below. Secondly, I just want to ask the question, and I really hope somebody responds in the comments section below, and I hope we get some discussion going on this. Why are they doubling down on this when it's so clear that men and boys are lagging behind in a lot of important areas in terms of education and overall employment? So let me know what you think in the comments section. I would really appreciate it. Moving on, under the guise of diversity, females are favored in the university administration and funding, and also in hiring, even though they are already a large majority. In few fields where men are prevalent, science, math, and engineering are now targeting for females to replace males. Will diversity be satisfied when universities are 70% female, 80% female, or when men are totally excluded? Social justice theory thus portrays the oppressors as evil and deserving to be overthrown and marginalized. Social justice discourse thus vilifies toxic males, racist whites, etc., and social justice policies are aimed at turning the oppression on the tables by replacing males with females, whites with non-whites, and so on. This is why a supermajority of females is still equity and diversity and is limited to preferred genders, races, sexualities, and ethnicities, and why the dead white men who created Western culture to build Western civilization should, according to social justice advocates, be boycotted. Social justice ideology is highly illiberal, in that it treats people not as individuals but as members of worldwide categories. In the name of justice, it treats all men as if they are the same, all whites as if they are the same, all colonial settlers as if they are the same, because, so the story goes, by means of their social structural position, they have the power and privilege. And all women, non-whites, and LGBT+ are the same, all victims. And although social justice claims that members of victim categories cannot be racist, sexist, or bigoted because they have no power, what is social justice but reverse racism, reverse sexism, and bigotry towards unfavored categories of people? So in conclusion, the article states, there is a kind of diversity that I do strongly support, intellectual diversity and diversity of opinion. It is only through the confrontation of different views, interpretations, and theories, together with evidentiary substantiation or refutation, that knowledge increases and improves. Social justice, with its equity, diversity, and inclusion of race, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity, has no room for diversity of opinion. No demonstration of that could ever be more better than the Dimensions Charter principles dictated by the Canadian government to all universities. Alright, some final thoughts before I let you go. As our last video made it clear, it is at least possible to reject these kind of initiatives and dictates, but I don't believe it is possible to break the positive feedback loop that occurs between academia and government-generated social justice policies without electing a government that doesn't want to have that much control over your life to begin with. These programs do nothing to increase the quality of Canadian education and only serve to swell the ranks of bureaucrats and administrators, and it's time to send a clear message to both governments and academic institutions that Canadians have had enough of these short-sighted policies. Fight for equality of opportunity and the insistence that all Canadians are treated equal, not equality of outcome and the quota-based society that the Trudeau Liberals have put in place. Alright, as always, thanks very much for watching the video. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button or leave a comment, as it really does help promote the channel. Until next time, you have been watching The Golden Door.